it's a bit of a different session today. I suggest maybe we start right off. We've got lots to cover, so let's begin. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to the final panel session of What is Consciousness? I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Party Center, and I'll be your host for today. Today we also have Jenna Axelrod, who will be a host as well, who's the Associate Director of the Party Center. And so as host, just feel free to just drop us a message if you have any problems, technical or not. The call today will have two parts. The first part will be a discussion with the panelists hosted by Jenna. And the second part will have questions coming from you, the audience. In this second part, we will alternate between chat questions and raise hand questions. Throughout the whole session, we will be looking at the chat throughout the call. So please submit your questions in the chat. But if you want to ask a question yourself, you can use the raise your hand function, which should be found in the bottom of your screen. Throughout the call, if you could please mute your microphone unless you're called upon. This is just for ensuring a good quality audio, so we may mute you if we hear any background noise. And finally, all the sessions are recorded as usual. You get the recordings 3 days after the session. So now, to open this panel, today we have 7 presenters. We have Richard Baker Roshi, who gave his presentation yesterday on the inner science, experiential investigation and analysis of consciousness. We have Valerie Hardcastle, who answered the question, what is the neurocorrelate of consciousness? We have Gary Lachman, who talked about Colin Wilson's Beyond the Robot, Consciousness and Existentialism. We also have Roderick, who had his session entitled The Mundane and the Mystical, a panentheistic perspective on the C.G. Jung's late thoughts about consciousness, ego, and self. We also have Paavo Pylkkanen, who talked with Basil Heidi about can quantum mechanics solve the hard problem of consciousness. And we also have Beverley Zabriskie, who talked about emotion, synchronicity, and surprise. And of course, we have the chair of the What is Consciousness event, director of the Party Center, Shantina Sabadini. A very warm welcome to all. And just to open this panel discussion, I'll pass it over to the moderator, Jenna Axelrod.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's so exciting and such an honor. And I will do my best to get out of the way, because we have such beautiful people who have chosen to join us today, and we're so honored. So we're going to try to go rapidly through some really heavy subjects. So the first question will be for all of the panelists, and it is an optional question. There are 3 formations of the question. You pick whatever way you'd like to respond. What is consciousness? Where is consciousness? Or what is consciousness for? And to open us up, Shantina, would you do the honors?
Sure. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So what is consciousness? The difficulty of such a question, which is in some ways similar to the difficulty of the question, what is time, is that consciousness is everywhere. We cannot conceive of saying anything if not already in consciousness. So it's like the difficulty of speaking about consciousness, understanding consciousness. So
feel free to get it.
Sorry about that. Well, the 2 basic approaches to consciousness are sorry. let's hope. Shut up. Okay, wanted to have a saying about consciousness. Well, there's two basic approaches in the various much more complex philosophical approaches to consciousness, which are materialism and idealism. Materialism assumes that what is there is essentially matter, that the whole universe is like a vast array of matter moving along the laws of physics. And consciousness is, in some sense, which we don't fully understand, an emergent phenomenon of matter. The opposite view, idealism, moves from the primary experience we have, which is consciousness, is being conscious of something. It has been said that Schrödinger, a physicist, said about consciousness that consciousness cannot explain in terms of the laws of physics, nor it can explain in terms of anything else, because consciousness is primary. So that's one point of view, and that's typically a point of view of idealism. From the point of view of materialism, consciousness is an emergent phenomenon that arises when a sufficient complexity in an organism is reached. But it has some basic difficulties it has to confront. And the classic one is what has been called the difficult problem of consciousness by David Chalmers. What does he mean by the difficult problem? It means that understanding what's going on in our brain, I perceive the color red, understanding what's going on in my brain in connection with that, and electromagnetic radiation hits my retina, a message travel along the optic nerve, and so on. All that is complicated, but it's not difficult in the sense of Chalmers' difficult problem. The difficulty is really that the experience of the color red is something essentially and radically different from electromagnetic radiation, from electric signals that travel along a nerve. Thank you. So I'll stop here. I'm just offering this notion of the difficult problem of consciousness as a key. And maybe add just as an additional fact that, interestingly enough, quantum physics makes the notion of matter quite a bit more problematic than we ordinarily assume. Essentially, quantum physics shows us that the world is not made of objects, of something which can be described independently of consciousness. Okay.
Come in.
I'll stop here and open.
Thank you, Shantina.
Pass it on to my colleagues.
That was a fun opening. Now, I think I heard a sound from Richard, but I don't think that was trying to get...
Just the person who helped me, one of the students here, just knocked on the door and I didn't want to leave the screen. I'm sorry.
Good. Tell them to call Shantina real quick. What is consciousness? Valerie, would you like to answer?
Sure. So I have almost 180-degree different perspective on consciousness than we just heard. And part of that, from my perspective, is you have to, or I have to, I guess I don't want to generalize the entire universe. I have to place a bet where I'm going to put my cognitive energy in trying to figure out how something works. And so I don't know how to understand things that are not material. To me, I live in a material world. That's the world I can punch, I can kick, I can tear, I can run experiments on. So I will place my bet there and see how far it takes me in trying to understand conscious phenomena. So I try not to think of it as something really weird and mysterious in our universe, but rather it's just another thing that I want to understand. So how might I understand it intellectually, scientifically? And when I approach it from that, it seems very clear that consciousness is something that resides in the brain in some fashion. You lose part of your brain, you lose part of your consciousness. I lose my arm, I don't lose my consciousness. And then from there, my perspective on it, and I just have to say this is my perspective, and since I have 5 minutes, I probably can't tell you why I ended up here so much, is really consciousness is what happens when your brain is trying to make sense of the world and build models of the environment that helps you move about in it, helps you understand what's in it, helps you to predict what's happened, helps you to remember what's happened. And so the conscious experiences we have really are, to me, just our mental models, imperfect as they are. They're not actually particularly good replications of our environment, but it's what happens when our brain meets the environment in a creature that needs to be able to predict the future. So we have to have some sort of modeling system for what's happening now, what's happened in the past, and what's going to happen in the future. And when you get sophisticated enough models of those, you get the experiences that we have. So I think I'll stop there because that's just kind of my big hand wavy picture of what I think consciousness is.
Thank you, Valerie.
Mm-hmm.
And I will acknowledge that it is unfair to ask this question with this kind of time limit. You did a wonderful job. What is consciousness? Where is consciousness? What is consciousness for? Gary Lachman, would you like to respond?
Hello, where are we? Right. Well, I just said the what is consciousness. I don't think that's a good question. I think Bergson said if you had a definition, it would only make it more obscure, because it's one of those fundamental things. Shantana was saying earlier. I'll be misquoting him, but a paraphrase of Whitehead. He says it's one of these sort of primary things that can't be explicated in terms of any factors that are that have more power to explain than they do themselves. If you know what I mean, there isn't a crowbar, you can't get under it, and sort of freedom or I don't know, time or whatever, things of that sort. So it's just kind of there, and or you can say, well, what isn't consciousness? Put it that way, because even the matter that Valerie was saying is, for her fundamentally what's happening here. Well, you only know about it through your conscious mind already. So it has to go through the sieve of the experience that you're trying to explain or anchor or locate in terms of something not it. But you can't, and we never see matter. No one's ever, we see things that are made of matter. We say they're made of matter, but no one's ever seen matter. Matter is an abstraction. I mean, this was something that came up early at an earlier talk. But I mean, to put it in the context of what I was talking about, and I'm going to go 5 minutes. I mean, in the kind of existential context we were talking about, I mean, matter, that's the fundamental existential experience of nausea, of contingency, Sartre's novel. I mean, things are more real than he is. So a doorknob frightens him. Or a kind of tree, a bowl in a tree. He looks at it and he does it. It's more real than he is, and he doesn't know what it is anymore. But in the opposite states, and even Quentin in the novel has one, and it's the kind of affirmative consciousness that Wilson was talking about. Somehow we seem free of that. We're not trapped in the moment, we're not trapped in a particular time and space. Our consciousness can range over wide areas. You know, we could have, as Proust, you know, in the beginning of Memories of Things Past, he tastes the Madeleine and suddenly he's back in time. He's stepped outside of time. So, I mean, I personally would get, I think you can get lost in the what is kind of question, and is it made of this and is it made of that? I mean, what's it like? When we kind of know what it is, we have it or we don't. What is it like? How do we maneuver in it? So, and what is it for? To get more of it, I think. So, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gary. That was exciting.
Thank you.
Roderick, would you like to respond? What is consciousness for?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that, but first maybe just a couple of things about consciousness itself. I mean, that I was thinking about the very word consciousness, and sort of looked into the Oxford English Dictionary, and it seems that the word in English, at any rate, wasn't used until the 17th century, i.e. at the beginning of the scientific revolution. So there may be a sense in which the word or the concept of consciousness as such, you know, may have co-emerged with the practice of quantitative science, with the sort of Galileo and Descartes and so on, who are sort of banishing consciousness and developing a purely quantitative approach to science. So just interesting to note that. Whereas in prior to that, if one takes, for example, much beloved of Jungian's alchemy, prior to the sort of scientific revolution, the quantitative and qualitative were not so separated. So there's one thing to note etymologically. A second thing to note etymologically is that the word comes from the Latin conscius, which means literally knowing together. That is, with others, knowing with others. You would be conscious of something in the sense if you had a secret with somebody else, you and somebody else knew something together. And it's interesting, it struck, that sort of etymology struck me as interesting, because consciousness in the sort of consciousness studies literature is often presented as the thing that is precisely what other people don't have access to. You know, it's what is the most private thing, and that can't be shared. All my behavior could be without consciousness, as far as you know, and only I know that it's conscious behavior, because it's, you know, from the inside. So these are sort of puzzles in understanding consciousness, and the notion of phenomenal feel and so on. These other terms that are sometimes used to characterize consciousness, or the phrase, "What is it like to be a bat?" or whatever it might be. The very idea of what is it like implies a comparison. It implies a correspondence. It implies some form of a relationship. You know, so again, I think that's an interesting thing to bear in mind, really. But I did want to say just a little bit about the question of what consciousness is for, because I mean, one can take a sort of an evolutionary view and say consciousness gives one an evolutionary edge. But there's also a tradition in Hermetic thought, in certain German idealism, and this found its way or emerged within Jung's thought as well, that consciousness is in some way, there are various ways in which this can be expressed, but in some way the universe is, or what's it for? It's in order that the universe can know itself, as it were. In other words, it's expressed in a sort of theological or cosmogonic sort of context. So Jung, for example, in ways that I alluded to or briefly talked about in my presentation, thought that consciousness in some way brings the world into being as a sort of second cosmogony, that without consciousness, conscious beings, the world would be there, but it wouldn't be known to be there. And when consciousness emerges and it comes into being, then that's a sort of like a radical jump into another sort of whole mode of being, if you like, conscious being, or being known. So I'll leave it there. Just as some other
Wonderful. Thank you, Roderick. Richard, would you feel like discussing what is consciousness?
Well, whether I feel like it or not, I try to say something. What you just said, Roderick, made me think they asked a bunch of kids, I think 7-year-olds or something like that, what is consciousness for? And almost all of them said to keep secrets. Okay, you know, the worldview of yogic worldview starts with the main dynamic is attentionality, not cognition. Again, as I said the other day, cognition is part of it, but attentionality, and that attentionality is a skill. It requires time and effort and intention to develop the skill of attentionality. And then the main thing that attentionality is opening up is not just attention you bring attention to, but to increase the whole field of knowing. We're in a field of knowing. All right. So what we would try to get a Zen practitioner to do, for instance, is to have some experience of what we call consciousness. So now, this is not a definition in terms of you know, the physics or psychology or cognitive science or something, just the practical effort of someone who's trying to develop or increase their sense of knowing. Okay, so what do? You say, please notice the mind you have when you wake up in the morning. Okay, what's that like? Well, generally we would call that in Zen practice consciousness. You know, oh, I've got to do so forth like that. Okay, then we'd say, all right, notice when you go to sleep, the shift from consciousness, when you can't quite go to sleep till you release consciousness. Notice how you release consciousness, and there's a kind of physical bump you go over. I think most people do. You're sleeping and you're almost sleeping, and then there's a kind of little bump and you're gone. Okay, so then the next question I could ask a practitioner is, okay, so notice the experience you have when you go over that little bump and you're suddenly asleep. Okay, now can you hold on to the feel of consciousness and go over that bump and keep the feel of consciousness in your sleeping? Now, that immediately leads into what do you call it when you dream and you
lucid dreaming.
Immediately leads into lucid dreaming. But lucid dreaming, it leads into a kind of knowing which isn't just lucid dreaming, a kind of lucidity that's present all night long. Somebody can come in and talk to you, and as long as it's not too discursive, somebody can talk to you and you can be deep asleep, you can answer their questions, talk to them. But if it's too discursive, you wake up. But if it's not discursive, you can handle information and physically stay asleep. So what we're asking people to do is to just notice that experience, notice these experiences without sort of trying to come to a conscious, confirmable definition. What you're trying to aim for is a feeling of knowing. So you know what it's like to the mind that appears when you wake up. Now, can you, and you can develop the ability to go back into a dream. There's several ways. Just before you wake up, you can sort of take an aspect of the dream or take the feel of the dream and then wake up. And then you can go back into the dream by calling forth that feeling, or you can remember that particular deal, a piece of white paper against a tree or something like that. And that will cue you into the dream. And what's interesting is sometimes you go back into the dream where you left off in the dream. And sometimes you go back into the dream because it's going on underneath. And you come in at a later stage of the dream. Tell me if I use up my 5 minutes. And what you notice when you learn that is you begin to discover that actually all day long you're dreaming. There's a dreaming layer going on all the time. And the more you begin to be able to see through that layer between waking and sleeping, you begin to feel the presence of the dream. Schizophrenics have problems with this, etc. But for a practitioner, you begin to feel the presence of the dream as a kind of another voice in the midst of situations, not a speaking voice, but a presence. And you can tell when certain dreams stay present during the day strongly and some don't, etc. So, okay, so this is what I would call just information that you're not trying to define, you're trying to notice and give some specificity to the noticing, but you're not trying to define it. And then what you do basically is incubate that information. In other words, my 5 minutes are up. Well,
yeah, but I'm trying to incubate information, so I don't know what to do.
Well, so the aim now is not to try to understand or understand, but rather just let this information incubate in you with a kind of sense of the presence of it over a period of months or days or something, and another kind of knowing shifts out of that incubation. That's enough.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I see Beverley is with us, but I don't see your camera on. Beverley, are you prepared to answer what is consciousness, or should I not be calling on you right now?
You're muted at the moment, Beverley.
That's an example of what I was saying, that I'll never be really prepared to answer what is consciousness. But I'll just give a few reflections from my practice as a Jungian analyst and someone who is very much influenced by Jung's approach. And I think Baker Roshi actually could be a Jungian analyst from what he just described, in case you ever want to switch to another career.
It's probably more profitable than being a Zen teacher.
Maybe you have more assurance in the next world, but in any case.
There ain't one, but that's all.
Well, the Dalai Lama once said he didn't know if there was either, but that was the bet he was going to make, to go back to Valerie's wonderful formulation of the bet she makes. Well, first of all, in my professional field, consciousness is the knowledge that we have in unconscious. And so one can be someone of great intellect and great accomplishment and great awareness. But if there isn't the knowledge that for everything we know, we have to always be humbly aware of what we don't know, then that person from that perspective would not be considered conscious. So I think consciousness is a very contextual term, and it would be very helpful to put the context around the person who's making the theory. So, so it's that recognition, and it's also the recognition that the psyche is the part, let's say the emergent aspect of the brain that has the capacity to reflect on what the brain and the body are experiencing. But Jung was very much at the effect. His major philosophical ancestor was William James. And William James believed that the body registered an emotion way before the individual did. And that our emotion wells up and then informs the mind of what the body is already registering ahead of time. And then we take a step back and try to reflect on what the body is experiencing. So Jung very much went with that idea, and also with the idea that James fostered about complementarity between the conscious and what he called the subconscious. And so that idea also left Jung very open to the ideas of complementarity in the realm of classical physics. So I was specifically asked to address the experience of synchronicity. And I think this is a good example of in my field, perhaps not in others, of what consciousness is for. Others have said it in very sophisticated ways, but consciousness is simply so we can have experience. And part of that experience is ideational one, but mostly it's also an experience that comes from our capacity to grant value to something, to an experience, to a person, which then fosters different levels of experience. So it then where we move with that is that emotion can express itself in a discharge or an action or a ritual or a gesture, an instinctive attraction, romantic desire, philosophic curiosity, identification with or possession, by systems of belief. So that all the narratives, whether they're in the realms of religion or mythologies, are expressions of intensity of emotions that build up so much in the experiencing person that they must give expression to it. And that is the major issue that we engage with, so that the person has the capacity to grant value. Now, where that's terribly important in synchronicity is if you understand that we are part of a whole species, multiple species system, if you understand that we are made up of the same dust as the astrophysicists study in stars, it's not surprising at all that there is a mind-matter connection. So that experience, I think you described it yesterday, of having a thought about a person, about to call them, and they called you. Well, if there's the understanding that we are part of the physics realm of the universe as well as the biological realm, that's not so surprising. There would be those non-local phenomena.
Yeah.
And, but rather than thinking that that has meaning coming at us from the universe, from a psychologist's perspective, it would be that the person grants significance to that experience. And that significance then moves to the next step of introjecting that and finding why it might have, or one can make meaning from it. It's not magical thinking at all. It's a move away from it. But in my experience, that most often comes up when the person who has experienced a synchronicity, grants significance to it, needs to be reminded that they are part of this immense system that we call our universe.
Thank you, Beverley. I'm sorry
all.
to interrupt you, but we have, I'm going to get back to you on the concept.
Well, I just finished, so.
I'm so sorry. I am very interested in what you're saying. We have Paavo on what is consciousness, and then we have gone through the full 7. Is that right? Paavo, are you with us?
Yes. Yes, I'm joining from my computer now, and in a more peaceful situation I had, and everything was okay with my son. I was a bit delayed, but he was okay. There was nothing. He was almost disappointed that he had no fracture. You know, that's the way it is. There was a football injury. Anyway, consciousness, of course, even there. So yeah, now I guess way I would come into it is perhaps in some ways I maybe work to some extent in a similar framework as Valerie, but then more perhaps from the philosophical point of view, in the sense that, of course, in philosophy, I think everybody would acknowledge that the brain has something to do with consciousness. Like, you know, Valerie was saying, if you lose your brain or parts of it, that will affect your consciousness, but it's not so with other, let's say, other parts of your body in the same way. But of course, then we, in philosophy, of course, we are puzzled by the features of consciousness, not necessarily just making it into a mystery, but it's perhaps more to do with that the kind of picture we get from the natural sciences, the so-called ontology. In philosophy, ontology means our view of what exists and what is the nature of that which exists. So of course, we have the entire mechanistic tradition that we have inherited with particles interacting and making up bigger things. And of course, then we added fields, like the electromagnetic field. And then the kind of mechanistic picture tells us how particles and fields interact with each other to create systems. And of course, a lot of neuroscience today is still looking at the brain in terms of fairly mechanistic concepts. So, action potentials where we have charged particles moving across membranes, and a lot of that, I think, can be understood in terms of classical physics. And of course, let's say from the theoretical or philosophical point of view, there's sort of nothing in classical physics. There's nothing in the ontology of classical physics that would kind of suggest anything like consciousness. And this is, of course, then I guess for those of us who still would like to have a physicalist explanation of consciousness or connect consciousness to the material world, that's why some of us have been looking into things like quantum theory and perhaps relativity like Penrose. And so that has also been like my early interest through people like David Bohm and Carl Pribram, who already I guess in 1980, I was probably in my early 20s, and they were talking about the theory, the holographic memory, and how that connects with physics. They were not necessarily talking that much about consciousness in the way we do today. But I guess for me, for my tender mind, that was like a very fascinating idea that, of course, nothing that I hadn't heard anything like that in the high schools, and they did there were things they didn't teach me in the college, as Sting would say, or even not even in the gymnasium. Okay, so that kind of that led me into that sort of a path of saying, and about consciousness itself, I think people have already described it. Of course, we mean things like experiencing, the subjective experience, the qualia, and all of those kind of properties, which to me, of course, have to do with some kind of access to information. In consciousness, something is presented to us. But then again, in my view, if we stay within the framework of classical physics, there is no sense in which we can create a situation where something is presented to something else and consciousness would be involved. And that's why I would go into a more exotic physical ontology. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paavo. I hate to stop any of you, but before we lose Gary, who has to move on in about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you the second question, which is, how do you understand the relationship between matter and consciousness? Is there an insoluble duality or a way to resolve the distinction? Thank you, Gary.
Oh, right. Okay. I guess I got mixed up. That's why I sort of addressed something of that in what I was saying before. But again, I mean, obviously they somehow go together, like love and marriage, as they used to say in the old song, or a soup and sandwich on the commercial that took the tune for that. But how? Well, we don't know, because we have a vocabulary that, in order to understand some aspect of what goes on in our experience, we've developed a vocabulary that separates these things. And we know we've labored under that for a very long time. So we have, and what that's led to, in one sense, is one side of the sort of the story, the soup, trying to say, well, the sandwich doesn't really exist. It's made up of bits of soup, really. And if you get down to the bottom of the sandwich, you'll find, which either way, it could be the sandwich saying the soup doesn't exist. If you know what I mean, it's like it's either, it's all matter or it's all mind. when it's neither all of any of those things. And you talk about William James, I would say it goes back to experience. And this is what I was trying to say before. Sorry, I mean, he doesn't talk about it in that way, but this experience of nausea, this experience of when, you know, you feel completely trapped in matter. I mean, how you feel, your felt experience. That would be a kind of sense in which consciousness is sunk, completely trapped in the here and now. I mean, you know, it's all well and good to be here now. At the same time, you know, a cow is here now. You know, I mean, and it can't be anything other than there then. And this is something that what happens in that negative experience of Sartre's of nausea. And the kind of thing Wilson is talking about is saying, well, that Sartre is saying that's true, but actually you have these other kinds of experiences where you feel free from that kind of contingency. You feel like you're somehow up above. And Nietzsche talks about, you know, feeling 6,000 feet above men in time when the inspiration for Thus Spake Zarathustra came to him. And I've mentioned Bergson and all that. So again, rather than getting into, I mean, we could talk about, you know, whether it's all atoms or neurons and all this kind of thing. I agree with George Steiner, who is a English, you know, literature scholar. And he said, our dictionaries lag behind our needs. So we have a felt need to develop a vocabulary in which we can talk about these things without having to separate them into these complete opposites. And at the same time, to pay attention to our own experience, as Richard was talking about. Because in a way, you can feel like you are sunk in matter. And other times when you feel free of it. So I would say, in a way, I would say mind's relation or consciousness relationship to matter is a function of consciousness itself. When consciousness is most intense, it feels most free of matter.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for being a part of this.
And I have to free myself of this and to move on. I have to go give a talk to the Theosophical Society here. And Richard, I just wanted to say, you might remember we met in Esalen back at the end of December 2019.
I remember, yes. And it's really nice to see you.
The perennial wisdom conference. So, and we swapped stories about New York. So in any case, adios, everyone.
Nice. Thank you. Enjoy your next talk.
Next time, and take care. Right, bye-bye.
Richard, would you like to address the question that was just asked? I can ask it again too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, ask it again so we're on the same page.
Love it. How do you understand the relationship between matter and consciousness? Is there an insoluble duality or a way to resolve the distinction?
Okay. First of all, I will introduce the concept very simply of an imaginal body. Okay. Now that sounds like I don't mean imaginary, I mean imaginal. You're imagining a body. But in fact, when you have an identity, that's an imaginal body. I'm liked, I'm smart, I'm not smart, etc. That imaginal body, you support and defend and etc. So Buddhism says, okay, let's use the practice, let's use the fact that we create imaginal bodies as a practice. And in the example I would just want to give here very simply, it's very clear that, you know, if I'm eating a salad, I'm having spinach and lettuce and tomatoes, and that's also me, so how do we make a distinction between sentient and insentient and matter and etc. So Yuan Wu says, who's one of the most convincing commentators on Buddhism, who put together the Blue Cliff Records, a book of koans. He says, without changing your daily activity, imagine the world has no outside and inside at all times. Never leave the feeling that there's no outside and inside. So, I mean, obviously there's molecules and atoms instead of it, but at our level of alteration and altercation or something like that, there is lots of differences. So he says, without changing your daily activity, so you're completely engaged in the Buddhas, I mean Mickey Mouse, and so forth. And but at the same time, you imagine always there's no outside and no inside, and you begin to act through this bodily knowledge and this bodily incubated knowledge that in fact there's a shared sameness with you and phenomenality, so-called phenomenality, and that begins to penetrate your activity. So you begin to know and act without a definition of it, you begin to know and act in the assumption that there's this mutually shared actuality, mutually shared relationality. And that mutual relationality begins then to change how you function in the world, just through the fact that you have incubated that possibility. Okay, that's enough.
Very cool. Thank you, Richard. Valerie, would you like to hear the question again or speak to what you've heard?
Sure. I don't think I need the question again, right? It's that, is there a distinction between matter and consciousness? Yeah, so again, I just come at this from a very, very different perspective, because I think the question is a poor question, and I don't mean that as an insult, but it's one that ultimately doesn't make sense because it's always matter all the time. We live in a material world, and so that's where you have to start. And I don't want to say they're non-physical things, but I would want to say you're going to have to drag me kicking and screaming to that viewpoint where we've tried every possible way to understand the world from a material perspective before I go there. And that's just a psychological fact about me, more than anything. And so I would say, no, consciousness is material, just like everything else is. That's just the furniture of our universe. We live in a material universe. And so of course, consciousness is going to be material. So then the challenge is trying to understand, well, what does that mean to say that consciousness is material? So I have a very short answer because I don't have an elaborate machinery that goes behind consciousness other than saying, yes, of course, it's made out of atoms and the interaction of atoms. And we just need to understand those interactions to understand consciousness.
Thank you, Valerie. Short and clear, unambiguous. I appreciate it. Shantina, would you like to respond or hear the question again or get a phone call?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll respond. I'll try to respond. Offering, let's say, the complementary point of view to what Valerie just said. I'm sensitive to the charm of your material world, Valerie. I've been trained as a physicist, so that's my business. Understand the world in material terms as far as it goes. But I would like now to propose another point of view, the point of view of starting from what I called before the primary experience of consciousness. Consciousness is the most immediate evidence we have. Before I can do or say anything else, I am. And by consciousness, I mean having experiences, which is how do we understand the material world if we start from that other point of view, from the point of view of consciousness as being primal? Then the immediate insight that comes with that is that matter is structure of experience. Our experience of the world is structured. The world is not a chaos, it's a cosmos. And one of the basic properties of cosmos is its material structure. I can fantasize that material structure existing out there, but that will still be my fantasy. But my fantasy is structured. It's if I move this computer a little bit to one side, the image you see will be different. If I go around this chair, I will see the backside of the chair. Edmund Husserl has proposed this way of understanding our being in the world and our experience as structured, as if then there is a big question mark with this approach, is the congruence of the world, the fact that we experience the world in a very basic sense in the same way. There you reach to all of physics and structure of experience. Okay, I think I can stop here. Hi, Jenna.
Hi, thank you, Shantina.
Most welcome.
Paavo, would you like to hear the question again?
Well, why not? So it'll remind us all. Yeah.
How do you understand the relationship between matter and consciousness? Is there an insoluble duality or a way to resolve the distinction?
Okay. So yes, of course, in philosophy, of course, some people would characterize philosophy as the main task of philosophy to overcome various dualisms, not just like matter and consciousness. It could be appearance and reality and different things like that. So for some reason, dualism is not thought to be such a great thing. And of course, the same is here. I guess somebody has their mic on. Getting a bit of an echo, but maybe not. Okay. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So anyway, of course, there are different ways of trying to overcome the thing. One is, of course, what a lot of people in what we might call a fairly materialistic Western academic culture is to reduce conscious experience to our current, let's say, neuroscience and things like that, because it's almost like, it seems to be like, there's a very strong assumption that the consciousness is a neural process. Perhaps in some ways, maybe something that Valerie was expressing, but of course, I think she can maybe explain it a bit more. And I think it's important to realize that that's also, like, in some ways a speculative assumption, in the sense that it would be, consciousness could be reduced to our current neuroscience or something pretty much like that. But then, of course, the other way is also to ask, well, what is matter? I think Shantina gave us one view how you could approach that, maybe more from take experience as primary and then take matter somehow out of that. That's of course a tradition also in I guess both Western and Eastern cultures. Some kind of more idealistic way of doing things, and but I guess myself, I'm tempted with the idea that there is a real world, as John Searle, he asks, does the real world exist? In face of these so-called anti-realist views, and I would be happy to say yes, the real world does exist. But our challenge is, of course, to look at our best scientific theories and formulate a view of the nature of the world. And of course, then ask, well, what about consciousness? Can we fit it in? And so, so of course, the kinds of views we have been exploring are more something like first formulate quantum ontology and see if we get anything from there. And the key idea in our approach has been that information is something that's fundamental in physics. It's a bit similar to what David Chalmers has been exploring also with his idea of double aspect theory of information. And for us, the key question is then that how does information become conscious? So we have a lot of information that's not conscious, which say that a lot of what's going on in the brain is, we want to call it information processing. A lot of it is not conscious, but then there's something that does make it conscious. And of course, we have a number of theories which connect to information and which try to provide an explanation of this transition from non-conscious to conscious. So of course, there's the integrated information theory of Tononi and others, which says that in some sense, consciousness has to do with integrated information. We have the Bernie Barr's view of global workspace theory of saying that consciousness has to do with some kind of, it's broadcasting. Consciousness is a kind of global workspace that broadcasts all over the brain. There are theories which I find very interesting are high order theories where you have two non-conscious mental states, you bring them into a certain kind of relationship and one of them becomes conscious. That's kind of taking a rabbit out of the hat, but those theories are also very interesting. For us, what I would claim in our approach with Bowman, Hiley, myself and some others, what we have is a kind of intrinsic information at the quantum level, something we have called proto-mental, which then we would claim is lacking in more classical physics approaches. And so our approach to consciousness would be to say that whatever makes that quantum so-called active information conscious, there may be some mechanism. That's how we are currently trying to approach consciousness.
Wow, thank you. Really interesting. Next, we're going to go to Beverley. And we're going to, I have a different question for you and after you for Roderick, before we go to the audience. But certainly if you were inspired to address what you've just heard, you'd be more than welcome to, but I'd like you to, if you're interested, what is the role of synchronicity in our understanding of consciousness? Oh, I'm sorry. You're still on mute, Beverley. I'm sorry.
I think I already addressed something of that in what I said before. So I would like to follow through being inspired by what the others have been saying.
Follow your heart, Beverley. We love it. We love
Well,
it.
hopefully my mind is also involved. And I think we're all talking about matter in a way, and it so much depends on what we most identify within ourselves as our material selves versus our non-material selves. And that very often has to do with different parts of our brain and then the so-called emergent process of our mind. So that if, for instance, out of my genetic material, I'm very identified with a certain part of my mind. Let's say I really identify myself with my left brain, so to speak, in the old categories. And I have right brain-like experiences. I may identify that as not me and something coming from outside of me. But if I take into account that there are different parts that I recognize as me and what I don't recognize as me, then so much of what I think is coming at me from far beyond myself may still be me, the material me. So I just think that what we identify within ourselves as us has a real effect on what we consider material and invisible, or material and emergent, or realized and emergent. So I just want to throw that in, because let's say I have certain tendencies that I've really identified with, and then I intervene with those tendencies from another part of ourselves. You can call that the higher power if it's a 12-step program. You can call that the voice of God, but it's still coming from another part of me. And both of those are material. And that doesn't mean that there isn't mystical experience and there isn't an openness to something invisible becoming visible, and inherent becoming explicate, or implicate and explicate. It just means I identify along that spectrum of experience. One of my favorite definitions of the brain comes from one of my favorite neuroscientists, who's Rodolfo Linas. I talked about him the other day. And he talks about the makeup of the human brain and how it's different from other brains. And he describes it as the human brain is like a musical instrument. And other brains may be too, but the human brain has the sympathetic cord phenomenon within it. In other words, it can hear what's going on in the sounds between, the spaces between. And so we know if that's part of our brain, then we don't have to dissociate from who we are in order to more explore that sympathetic cord, which also allows us then to hear what we might not first hear, but do hear on careful learning and hearing and reflection. So I just wanted to add that in. And in other words, consciousness is whatever consciousness we have is a limit case, and including what we identify within ourselves.
Thank you. Beautiful. Now, Roderick, you're in an unusual position of, you also can choose, would you like to stay the course with the question that has been posed to everyone, or would you like this random new question alone? And I will read you both, or either or neither, as you request.
Well, read me neither, and I'll address both briefly.
Wow, wonderful.
I mean, just briefly, in relation to the question that's being discussed about the relation between sort of matter and consciousness. I mean, just to say, I feel particularly attracted to a sort of dual aspect monist approach to this, which is to see a sort of mind and matter as being sort of epistemic aspects of an underlying ontic reality, which is neither material nor mental in itself, but as it were, in it, when we know it, when we know that reality, we know it as it breaks down into or decomposes into material and mental aspects, and that view I think makes good sense. Segueing into the other question, makes good sense of synchronistic events, because that sort of decomposition ensures that there are correlations already between the mental and the physical, if you like. So just to pick up the next question about the relationship of the role of synchronicity in our understanding of consciousness. I mean, there are certain ways which one can say that synchronistic experiences can affect consciousness. So, for example, if one has a one-sided attitude, one consciously has a one-sided attitude, a synchronistic experience, like a dream, can compensate that and can lead to some sort of transformation of it, or simply the fact of disclosing unexpected connections amongst events can lead to expansions and transformations of consciousness. So synchronicity can certainly, operate on consciousness, affect consciousness, and so on in various ways. But I think it's also what I also find interesting thinking about different modes of consciousness, and I would, you know, distinguish between sort of a dualistic consciousness where we experience a strong subject-object separation, and a what might be called a more participatory consciousness where the subject and object, observer and observed, are in a sort of much more intimate connection and mutual transformation, if you like, an interrelationship, and then unitive forms of consciousness where there is a sort of subject-object synthesis or unity. So sort of moving from more sort of scientific objectivist sort of dualistic consciousness where you know I can observe the world without really affecting it, to a more participatory relationship where my engagement with the world affects me and I affect it, to the sort of more mystical range of experiences where there is a sort of a unity of subject and object. And I think synchronicity is an interesting phenomenon because it, in some way, it sort of facilitates the transitions between, or expresses in some way the transitions between the dualistic and participatory consciousness and between participatory and unitive consciousness. And I'm thinking, I mean, Jung makes various statements about synchronicity in his principal essay on it. He talks about how synchronicity helps one to get rid of the incommensurability between the observed and the observer. For example, he talks also about how synchronicity helps one to think in terms of the whole, a whole in which includes the thinker, as it were. And I think one could even formulate synchronicity as a, because in a sense synchronicity is a relationship. It implies a sort of a unitary reality. Jung talked about synchronicity. Another way he described it was being the parapsychological equivalent of the unus mundus, a sort of the equivalent of a unitary worldview as expressed in psychophysical or, as he called them, their parapsychological events. So I think he was feeling his way towards a view in which you could see synchronicity as, in a sense, a form of simultaneous observer-observed duality and unity, so that you're you experience the separateness, but you also experience the unity, and there's a sort of a, you know, one can experience one or other side of that that particular opposition more or less. So I think there's, you know, synchronicity is an interesting concept in relation to different modes of consciousness, in understanding different modes of consciousness, as well as the transformations within consciousness as we ordinarily understand it. So I'll just say that.
Beautiful. I just want to thank you all. This has been really fascinating from all of you, and I'm sorry we couldn't hear from all of you for much, much longer right now, but it is now time to move into the question and answer period. So I'll hand back to James, who will guide us through the audience questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna, for this panel discussion. It's been really, really interesting. And yes, so we're going to open it up to all of you, the audience. As I said earlier, if you can either use the raise your hand function under reactions or write your questions in the chat. I'd like to just start this by reading one of these questions that have come through the chat, which is basically just an expansion of one of the questions that have been asked already. We've talked about mind and matter, but what about imagination? What is the relationship between consciousness and imagination? And also, what is the range of imagination? Does it have a limit? So whoever wants to go first, feel free to jump in. Yes, Beverley. You're muted again, sorry.
I am obviously ambivalent about being heard, so I demonstrate that. Well, Jung talked about imagination as what gets constellated in the mind when we've run up against a wall of all germs of possibilities through our thinking. And that we have to let ourselves drop down into another level of non-thinking, which is today called a very unsexy term, the default network system. Horrible for what this is about. But that musing state, and then something arises that we would not have been able to think or even feel our way into. And Linas talks about imagination as being the physics of the mind. In other words, something really gets activated and is moving. And if we follow along with it, then we're in a more dynamic process. So I just like those two different aspects of it. And just one more thought, and then I'll be quiet, which is a statement that Jung made in a 1952 letter. And he talks about how, given that space and time are not part of the universal laws, but rather human constructs to frame our mortal experience, that we may have to give up the categories of time and space and experience the brain and the psyche as an unextended intensity or unextended intensities. I think that opens up many avenues. So thank you.
Thank you, Beverley, for that. Does anyone else have a follow-up or like to build on that, a comment?
I'd like to, because in many respects, I think my perspective, although I use very different language to express it, is aligned with what Beverley is talking about, up to maybe the very end. And I'm not quite sure I understood all of that, but the idea that the brain is taking in information that it receives from the environment and then doing something with it. And then from my perspective, what it's doing is imagining. And some of our imaginations are rather simple in the sense that, we get particulate matter on our tongue, and then all at once we know, oh, I'm eating a taco. Well, it's not that there's taco-ness that's being transmitted to our tongues. There are other things. And then our brain takes that information and builds this whole story about what we're doing. And so some of our imaginings are, I would say, are really well grounded in information that we receive from the world, whether it's visual or auditory or gustatory or olfactory or touch or whatever. But then some of it is less attached to environmental stimuli, in that I am imagining what clothes I'm going to wear tomorrow. Well, I'm not even staring at my closet right now. And then you can imagine further, well, what if I had a completely different career? Or what if I weren't even here? Then what would the universe be like? You can continue to imagine further and further. But for me, the basic building blocks is our brain trying its best to make sense of the world, to project itself into the world, and to do that successfully, because we're very complex organisms, we have to drag our past with us, and then also envision a future, because that to me is how our brain operates in these bodies in this world. And so it's very fundamental. Imagination is very fundamentally tied to perceptual experience as well as conscious experience, from my perspective.
Thank you, Valerie, for that. Unless anyone else would like to build further, we can move on to the next question, which will come from Ilana.
Oh, yeah. Would like a brief scenario and help me to understand. I was working with a little boy who had hydrocephalus, and he was operated several times. He came at age 3 into my practice. I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, somatic education. And it was very difficult to make contact with him at first, but I found ways of playing, and he taught me how to really approach somebody who basically is very, very afraid of adults. When he was 11, I was going to move from England to France. And the last session I gave him was basically when his younger brother had hit him over the head. He was 11, William, over the head, and he had a bad headache and he was in a bad state. His mother called me, "Can I come, please?" And I worked with him. On an airbed which I constructed, and he went to sleep. He was really in a state not like usual. He was crying and so on. Anyway, he went to sleep, and at one point I heard the clippity-clop of a horse going through our courtyard, and we lived there for 25 years. I never heard a horse. I got up and looked, and I just saw a man on horseback without a saddle going out of the courtyard. At that point, William woke up and said, "Was it a horse?" And I quickly picked him up, and he looked and he saw that horse disappearing. And the only thing that ever really, except for our relationship, he said, "You are not my teacher, you are my friend." The only other relationship he had was really with horse riding. And he was completely changed. And I had just been thinking before I heard the horse in the courtyard, maybe he was smiling, maybe he's thinking of his horse. Now, what is going on? Because it wasn't just me, but it was also the child. And the interesting, I could have imagined, afterwards I thought it was a dream, but then his mother reported as they was driving home, they stopped because there was a man with the horse and William talked to the horse. So what is going on? That is something which goes beyond what we've been talking about just now, because there are actually two human beings involved.
Who would like to try and address that? Yes, Beverley. And yes, you're muted again.
I will do it if no one else wants to. I mean, I would imagine just from the passion with which you're speaking that we're very identified with wanting almost to transfer libidinal energy to this boy. And that his horsepower was very much your own concern. And that attunement to that issue could, as in mythology, give rise to the image of a horse because of the libidinal horsepower that one carries. And that was very alive between the two of you. And so you'd be extra attuned to also hearing that horse. And in your shared space, which is a kind of perceptual space, both of you would be very alert to it. So again, if you want to grant significance to it, one easily can do that. And then it would take time to make it a synchronicity by understanding or giving it some meaning for yourself and for your relationship with that boy.
But that still leaves out the question, there was an actual material horse in a courtyard where this never ever happened, that somebody on horseback without a saddle rides around out and is then seen by the mother as well later. So that's beyond me.
Well, again, if you follow that quote from Jung's letter about at some point we have to give up categories of time and space and think about psychic energy as an intensity. I mean, it's up to you to make, but obviously it's impressed you, it impressed the boy, and that's an incredibly significant and valuable experience for which I'm sure you're most grateful.
Thank you, Ilana, for your question.
Thank you, Beverley. Yeah.
Next question will return to the chat. Question from Alan. So at the beginning of the session, we all tried to answer the question, what is consciousness? But as Alan pointed out, it mainly came from a 21st century scientific mindset. Did earlier civilizations from hundreds or thousands of years ago have a mind or mindset which would be more suited to answering this question? What might they say, and would they give a more complete answer? Who wants to try and answer that question? Richard or Roderick? Or maybe, oh, Roderick.
Well, I don't know really about answering it, but I'll say something. I mean, in a way, that's partly why I quoted the sort of the definition of consciousness and how, or the sort of etymology of consciousness, and that it come into the English language. I don't know about other European languages, but at around the time of the scientific revolution, as though you know, there were particular ways in which we're thinking about this now, which are sort of historically created, as it were, and certainly prior to this time in the ancient world, there were certainly materialistic worldviews. I mean, the Epicurean worldview and the Lucretius rerum natura, but probably the sort of big question of mind-matter relations and the nature of consciousness wasn't so clearly defined, or wasn't so much of a problem in the way, or a specific problem that it's become now, particularly post-Cartesian world. So there certainly were models in religious models, spiritual models, philosophical models that in which consciousness was, or some sort of mentality, or some sort of something that was not from which consciousness was not stripped away. Let's put it that way. Which gave rise to what we experience, what the sort of generative source of our reality. So, and that was just, that was just the way in which these different models and the sort of endless numbers of them were formulated. I mean, all of the sort of major religions, the philosophies from Parmenides and Pythagoras and Plato and so on, all presupposed some sort of level of reality which was not what we experience in terms of the sort of basic, the sort of sensory world that we might designate as material. There was something else. So. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, and I saw Richard put his hand up a moment ago, so maybe he's got something to add from his perspective.
Thank you, Roderick. And yes, Richard, go ahead.
Well, since Roderick, you had the courage to just jump into this, I thought, geez, I had to support you. Yeah, I don't know if I have much to say, but I don't. When I was in, I've always been interested in why, what, and how, and what particularly, and I really was drawn to science and math and things like that. But I found the how of things more engaging, and that led me into history. So when I was in the university, I spent quite a bit of time studying how, in medieval times in Europe, how'd they think about it? They thought about things differently. And I read in those days, microfilm texts and, stuff like that. But then when I met my teacher, when I was in my mid-20s, I still had this sense of how do we think about things? And I'm trying to make this short and to the point. I realized that he was in a different attentional world, perceptual world than I was. So I thought, geez, well, he's teaching Buddhism and Zen and meditation, but really, if I look at him, he's in a different world, and it's hard for him to teach because he takes for granted the world he's in. And one of the unusual things for him as a teacher was he didn't take for granted that we were in the same world he was. And that made him quite different than most Japanese teachers who came. They had just assumed we all share the same world. Anyway, so the point I'm making is one little small thing. Someone asked him, when very early in the first few months of his being in the United States, if I remember, in San Francisco, what do you notice about America? And in the Japanese community, one of the first things people noticed in California was that the pine cones can be as big as footballs. They do not have pine cones like that in Japan. So we thought he'd say something like that maybe. But what he said was, I noticed that you do things with two hands. No. So I began to watch him very carefully. If someone asked him, please pass the salt, for instance, he would pick up the salt, bring it into the field of his body, and he wouldn't just hand it. It wasn't at all getting the salt to the other person. It was bringing yourself to the other person through using the salt. So he would turn, almost like there was a light here, he would turn and shine his bodily light on the person, and they would take it, and I noticed he would take it back when they handed it back with two hands, and then he'd bring it into the field of his body and then put it down. So I began to observe this, and it wasn't just simply he did things with two hands, although a friend of mine made a movie called The Colonel Comes to Japan. And it was about Kentucky Fried Chicken, the first Kentucky Fried Chicken in Tokyo. John Nathan made the film, and for NPR, and they taught the people, if you're giving them the hamburger or whatever it was, or the chicken, you turn your whole body, pick it up, and then you turn your whole body back. You don't just hand things like that. They were actually taught by the ordinary managers of Kentucky Fried Chicken to always give the person frontal body, not like this, but like this. And sometimes they'd correct them. Now you could have picked up three, or only pick up one thing if you can't, just, okay. So what I noticed is that he had a feeling, and I said it the other day, last night, that of this, what I'm just trying to use Western words, exterioceptive and interioceptive space you can, tangible space you can feel. He articulated that all the time with his hands. So he was in a place where he was feeling almost like he was an antenna or something like that. And he was moving in the space of other and sharing. And there was a feeling like, oh, I'm going over a little bump into the other person's space or something like that. So I took my interest in medieval thinking being so different from ours to suddenly realize, hey, something's going on in East Asian culture that's very different than, and so it's like, if you want to study Zen, if you're trying to study Zen, if this is Zen, in Western culture, doesn't quite fit. You have to discover the mindset, the body set that the teaching was developed for. Then the fit gets, and much of the mindfulness teaching going on today doesn't have much to do with the real fit of what mindfulness is about, and particularly in this a sense of interior and exterioceptive space. And I see your hand up, James Pete Barberi, and I am stopping.
Great, thank you, Richard, for your, great story. Next question will come from a hand raised, Mark.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'd just like to touch on two things. So one of them's already been touched on is synchronicity, but the other one is telepathy. Today is my mother's birthday, and it's 27th of June, and she's a twin. And growing up, now I don't have any direct experience of this. It's all secondhand, but she would report it to us that you know, that she would know there was something wrong with her twin sister who lives in San Francisco. My mother lives in Ireland, so there's quite a distance, and she'd get a sense there was something wrong, and she'd feel it all day, and then she'd get a phone call in the evening, and there would be something wrong. You know, this kind of sense that they were connected. So that's a kind of telepathic experience that my mother would report to me, and others have written in books and stuff about it. I don't know much about it, but that's one thing. The second one is synchronicity, and what I think Jung used the word psychoid, where, you know, the physical and the mental somehow conjoin. And I suppose my question is this: both of those phenomena, and they're hard to study with a standard scientific way of doing it, because a lot of them are one-off events, so they can't be repeatable in the laboratory. But those two phenomena, question I would have, if consciousness is firmly located in the mind, and in the brain, or somehow firmly linked to the brain, both of those phenomena seem to have this psychoid element, or certainly outside of one mind anyway. And synchronicity has this kind of external physical link to it. So my question would be, where are those phenomena located?
Thank you, Mark. Who wants to try and answer the question about telepathy and synchronicity? Yes, Roderick.
Well, I'm happy to say something. I mean, those phenomena were written. I mean, when Jung wrote about synchronicity, he wrote about obviously about synchronistic events, but also about telepathy and about a range of other things, other kinds of events, such as near-death experiences and so on, all of which seem to challenge, or in some way, or to problematize, shall we say, the sort of the idea that that consciousness is in some way emergent from the brain, or is a sort of product of the brain, and suggests that in some way consciousness can exist independently of the brain. And there, you know, and there have been lots of studies which purport to have sort of added to the database of that sort of evidence, challenging the idea that consciousness is dependent on the brain. You know, for example, where whole areas of the brain become sort of non-functioning, and yet consciousness continues, or at death the brain is clinically dead, or the person is clinically dead, the brain is not functioning, but they still have experience, which they, you know, if people are subsequently revived, which can be sometimes verified. Sort of, they have observations and so on, which are sometimes verified. And so there's a sort of, you know, there are problematic data like that which suggests that that perhaps instead of seeing the brain as productive, the brain is more of a kind of filter, or is that the consciousness is a sort of I mean, William James, who's been mentioned as here already today, was of the view, along with Frederick Myers and others, of early sort of explorers in consciousness, in psychology, that in some sense the brain or the mind exists, you know, the mind at large, I think it was the phrase that James used, exists or can exist in some sense beyond the brain, and gets, as it were, stepped down or filtered into the forms that we need to operate in our sensory reality. So it's a different sort of view of the relationship between consciousness and the brain, sort of inverting the previous one. Our first speaker in this series gave a sort of very detailed account of analytic idealism which is a kind of version of that sort of model, if you like. Yeah, and you know, I think there's a lot. I mean, idealism is one approach which would take that view, would sort of do that inversion. But within that sort of framework, or within the sort of framework that I mentioned earlier, a sort of dual aspect monist view, where there is where again the consciousness doesn't, as it were, emerge from the brain straightforwardly, but rather the material and the mental aspects of whatever it is we're correlating both emerge from some sort of underlying unitary psychophysically neutral domain. That's also sort of, you know, is a way in which one can understand phenomena like synchronicities, telepathy, and other kinds of experiences which seem to challenge a straightforward view of consciousness as being an emergent property of the brain. So I think, you know, there's a lot of interesting literature out there on these issues, and yeah, they're certainly, you know, that you raise these phenomena, they're worth thinking about, because there is a lot of material out there that seems to suggest, that seems to challenge or is problematic for a production model of the brain, and you know, and I don't think one can just sweep it under the carpet. I mean, I think one has to sort of think about it seriously, how it can be accommodated in a theory that is adequate to make sense of those phenomena, rather than to deny them.
Thank you, Roderick. Sorry, Beverley, I do see your hand. Just like to just move on, because I can see there are many questions popping up. We'll take the next question from Richard Ott.
Yes, thank you. I'm a retired surgeon, and I have had experiences with patients who reliably underwent near-death experiences in which they reported seeing things that, with the more materialistic understanding of consciousness, could never be explained. Literally, their mind going down the hallway in a hospital and witnessing things that were late, while they were, by the way, clinically unconscious in a coma, and noting things down the hallway that nurses later corroborated as yes, but we have no explanation how that person could have possibly seen that. So in follow-up to Roderick's comments and Ilana's as well, my question is this, from any who wish to answer this: do you believe, or better yet know, whether there is inherent meaning in the universe as manifested by correspondences, synchronicities, and miracles?
Thank you for that question. Richard, I see your finger up.
I really don't have much to say, but I'll say something like Roderick. I've had quite a lot of experiences, as you have mentioned, Richard Ott, from when I was in high school, and it led me into what I'm doing partly. But my own experience, if I'm looking at experientially, I find that I don't feel there's any meaning or God or miracles that completely doesn't interest me. That's partly, it just doesn't interest me. But I do feel that my experience is that it's not the mind reaching out and understanding things. It's that there's a kind of, what my experience is, whatever that means, it's a rather subtle experience and it's hard to speak about even, is that there's a kind of database, information base. There's a kind of music that's connecting everything. And sometimes if the tune is strong enough, you sort of tune into that. I can remember somebody, and when I was living in Japan, they woke up in the morning and they said, they told me they'd had a dream at the night that they were bicycle riding with their father, and then their father kept falling farther and farther behind and disappeared into the mist. And the father kept saying, "Go on ahead, don't wait for me, go on ahead." And this person I knew the next day found his father died that night. So I know enough experiences like that something's going on, but it doesn't feel like consciousness to me. It feels like some kind of information. And there's a concept in Buddhism called the Alaya Vijnana, which is still developing within Buddhism. And I'm trying to think about how it functions myself, is that there is this base which you're contributing to and is contributing to you, and there are various ways you tune into that base. But it's not like you know it with your mind. You can tune in, and it's like Frank Barron did a lot of his students did a lot of the early work on twins who buy the same kind of car, flush the toilet the same way, etc., even though they were separated at birth. So something's going on, and my own feeling is that some kind of field of information that you activate and you develop a sensitivity to, and you develop its articulation as well. That's enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Richard. Next question will come from Eddie.
Thanks to all the speakers, and also thanks to the Parry Centre, who must put a tremendous amount of work and effort in organizing things like this. I think, or feel actually, an important question to ask about consciousness is consciousness alive? Like, I experience, of course, my body as being alive, but I also experience that consciousness is alive. And I was wondering about that in the context of the conversation. And then I was thinking in terms of, is there an evolution of consciousness, which I suspect there are. And then I was thinking, well, there couldn't be an evolution of consciousness unless consciousness was alive. And then what Ilana was saying, I found, and Richard, of course, as well, the surgeon, was saying was very interesting for me in the context that if consciousness is alive, then there may, whatever way we explain the experience that Ilana had, may not be capturing the experience. And ultimately, it may be impossible to totally capture that experience. And it's so basically that's just to express my own experience. And in this context of what might be leading me to have the experience that consciousness is alive, well, synchronicity is one. And I'm very delighted to notice that Mark and myself have great synchronicity. We're both Irish. But also, what really grabs me all the time with the sense that consciousness is alive is not so much intentionality as the unintentional. So there's something totally, it seems, incredibly magical about my body, which is alive, that is beyond my understanding. But I feel the same mystery applies to consciousness. So that was just what I wanted to say.
Eddie, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Valerie or Paavo, would you like to say something about this? Is consciousness alive?
Well, again, I come at this from a rather different perspective. And so I don't think of consciousness as being separate from the body, as it were. And so insofar as organisms are alive, and those are the things that have consciousness, then I guess I would say it's an aspect of being alive. But I don't think of it as being alive apart from any sort of human body. But I do agree that consciousness can evolve just as though organisms can evolve and our thoughts can evolve and so forth. And, you know, as people discuss their inner reflections and being able to make better and more refined distinctions of their conscious experience, you know, very much a phenomenological perspective, I think that's entirely good and appropriate. And it's part of what organisms do in this environment, is grow and learn about our environment so that we can interact with it more effectively.
Can I just quickly say, and thanks very much, Valerie, because you allow me to make something clear of what I was trying to say. No, I'm not saying that if consciousness is alive, it's separate from the consciousness or the life of my body. But what I am wondering and suspecting that it's different, but not separate.
And I would say I think the it's again perhaps like a strong intuition that that we've had in the work we've been doing with Basil Hiley now recently, and actually before this also that maybe also life has to do with something, either quantum mechanics or something similar to it. And now why is that? Well, there is this whole what we see with quantum systems is this kind of organic unity. Actually, some people like to actually describe some of these quantum systems like superconductivity as exhibiting some sort of unity that we don't see in the classical physics. And of course, it's tempting to speculate that what actually living organisms are in some way or another making use of some of these, something like quantum coherence or some of these so-called many-body states, and so this is and of course, I mean, some of you are aware that there has been some proposals within an area called quantum biology. Of course, these are speculative theories, but still fairly well. I mean, they're published in good journals, if that means anything, and sort of suggesting that there could be these effects. And in some ways for us, then it's also natural to say that if life requires quantum, then perhaps consciousness, and if consciousness requires life, in the sense that they are somehow both required this same certain kind of circumstances. And these are, again, I think, ideas that in a typical, more mechanistic natural science, people would just say, well, we understand already what life is, and there's nothing there's nothing no interesting fundamental distinction between living systems and non-living systems. But I guess our intuition, which again, if it's an intuition, one shouldn't give too much weight to it. But it's definitely an intuition that we have, is that life has to do with some either quantum mechanics literally or something quantum-like, and the same goes for consciousness. And in that sense, it doesn't mean that, again, I would agree with Valerie. I don't think that consciousness, we would separate consciousness from the living organism, but perhaps more say that consciousness does require life. And for example, current attempts to develop artificial consciousness, insofar as they lack these quantum coherent states, we wouldn't think they would be conscious in any genuine sense.
Thank you so much, Paavo, for your answer, and thank you, Eddie, for asking it. As we only have 10 minutes left, maybe we'll take one more question that will come from Gary. Oh, we can't hear you, Gary. You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So I was just saying thank you to everyone who participated. I've been reading a book by a fellow by the name of Philip Goff called Galileo's Error, a new foundations for a new science of consciousness, and linking that up to Walker Percy's ideas about symbolization and the process of symbolization. And the general idea is that Galileo intentionally made the decision to eliminate consciousness from physical science in order to move forward with understanding science from a physical foundation as a dyadic process, right? As a mechanistic dyadic process. The problem is that there's another level of meaning and signification